Hello, everybody, and welcome to Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com and our YouTube channel, and everywhere you can find subscriptions to podcasts like ours, so you can get it automatically on your phone. And you're used to seeing my illustrious co-host, Dennis Ramundi, but as of late, he is unable to be with us. He'll be back soon, so we can resume being the Huntley Brinkley of spirituality. For those of you old enough to remember who Huntley and Brinkley were. And we hope that you do subscribe. It's free, and we want to keep it that way. And so if you're also moved to contribute so we can cover expenses, that would also be great. Today, we have with us a most welcome guest making his second appearance on Spirit Matters, but it's been a few years. Robert Jonas is, in addition to being an old friend of mine, an author, musician, environmental activist, and retreat leader, and is the founder and director of the Empty Bell, a contemplative sanctuary based in Northampton, Massachusetts, with an emphasis on Buddhist-Christian dialogue and the arts. He is also a master at the shakuhachi bamboo flute. I have had the pleasure of hearing him play live and on recordings, and it's a traditional Zen instrument, and one I highly recommend you listening to. And here today, we are going to talk about his new book, My Dear Far-Nearness, the Holy Trinity as Spiritual Practice. There it is. So my pronunciation and the difficulty of translating a hyphenated word into the spoken language, you see the cover. Very good.
And your blurb is right here.
I blurbed it.
On the back cover.
It was worthy enough for me to blurb. Well, Jonas, welcome. Good to be with you. And for those who don't know you, he prefers to be called Jonas, even though it's presumably his surname.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome back. Good to see you, as always.
Thank you.
And for our listeners, we normally begin with a overview of the guest's spiritual history, but you gave us that when you were on the first time. So we recommend you go back if you want to know more about Jonas and his past.
It's good.
Please listen to his first recording with us. And I will, while I'm at it, we also interview Jonas's wife, Margaret Bullitt. Is it Bullitt Jonas? No, it's
Bullitt dash, a lot of dashes here. Bullitt dash Jonas. I'm going to close my door, by the way.
And I highly recommend you go and listen to our interview with Margaret, who is a Episcopal priest and environmental activist. Jonas.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's begin with an obvious question. The title of your new book. What does My Dear Far-Nearness mean?
Yes, thank you. My Dear Far-Nearness is a name for God that was coined by Marguerite Porete in the 14th century, a medieval mystic, a brilliant woman, very deep, compassionate, love-inflamed life, really. And it turns out she was too brilliant for the Catholic hierarchy. So in 1310, she was burned alive at the stake.
Wow.
In Paris. Yeah, My Dear Far-Nearness. And I love the title that she gave us because the divine is both near and far. We're one in the divine, but there's also the value, the beauty of distinctions. That I'm not Phil, Phil is not me. You know.
Is it also resonant with it being omnipresent, always here, nearer than near, and yet there's a feeling sometimes in seekers of it being, of the divine being inaccessible, hard to reach, far in the sense of seemingly out of grasp? Is there also that part of it?
Yes, yes, far, far in the sense of another word that's used is transcendent, you know. And the way I work with it in the book, My Dear Far-Nearness, is by the way, I should say that I'm working from a Christian perspective, but I've also been trained in Zen and somewhat in Tibetan and Vipassana Buddhism, and I have relationships with Hindu teachers. So, but through all these experiences of other faiths, I've retained this fundamental groundedness in the Christian Dear Far-Nearness. So what the book does is to go spelunking, you know, this word cave exploring, go deep into the cave of our hearts to explore who we really are. And in the Christian tradition, who we really are is the Holy Trinity.
I want to get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But something came up while we were talking about this near and far seeming duality. I remember reading the Christian mystic philosopher Simone Weil, and something, she used a metaphor that stuck with me. She was saying that the yearning for God is in itself a connection, and the feeling of frustration is, in a sense, a practice. And she compared it to two prisoners separated by a cell, a wall of a cell, who communicate through the wall. So the wall is a separation, but also the means of connection.
Oh, I like that. That's beautiful.
Does that make sense in your context?
It sure does. You know, part of my background is psychotherapy, and I was trained in what's called a psychodynamic approach, basically. And what I learned in that practice, as I worked with people, is that we have an ego self, and that ego self is formed from childhood through from birth to childhood, young adulthood, eldership, primarily in relationship. It's relationships that form our ego self, and we need to have an ego self. And I made the mistake when I was younger of thinking, well, you got to get rid of the ego. Ego's bad. So the way I work with the wall and the knock on the wall is that this is actually my experience, as much as I can put words on it, is that the ego, as we dance this spiritual life, the ego becomes more and more transparent. So we always will have an ego, and that grounds us in our relationships and in our work and how people know us, whatever, in the everyday world. But it becomes transparent, so that through us, we see through the wall of our ego, which is now transparent, we see this light that is eternal. And eternity is a really important word for me because, you know, growing up Christian, Jesus often talked about eternal life, and St. Paul talked about eternal life. Well, but when I was growing up Lutheran in Wisconsin, eternal life was something you got later if you were good.
Yeah.
It was essentially a moral thing. But now what my practices in the East, Buddhism and Hinduism and so on, have taught me is that eternity is always here. It's always in the present. And when I am really present, I'm my ego is transparent to this vastness, this limitless sense of presence. And presence is, I use that word a lot. Presence. Yeah.
And that's eternal.
Yes.
This is fascinating. You touched on ego, and my early teachers disavowed us of the notion of killing the ego and extinguishing the ego, because all ego means is your individuality, and as long as we're embodied, we will have an ego. And they would talk about expanding the ego so it reaches the eternal, and you're talking about making the ego transparent. It's a very similar thing. And
no, it's different. It's different because as a psychotherapist, I'd say if you expand the ego, we call that narcissism.
Well, no, I get that, but that's not how they meant expand.
No, I understand. Yeah, and this is why intercultural conversations are so tricky.
Yeah, and why language is so tricky, because if you say, "Oh, make your ego transparent," they'll say, "I don't want people seeing through me."
Right, exactly. Yeah, but when you see through me, you see the light, capital
L. Tell us why you wrote this book. What was and I want to get to what you mean by the Trinity and how you interpret that, because it's such a live topic in the context of a Christian culture. But tell us why you wrote the book. I'm sure those two are related.
I'm going to do that in two different ways. First, to touch on the Trinity. Most Christians on Sunday morning, when they go to the church, they'll recite the Nicene Creed. And the Nicene Creed is the creed that proclaims God as a Trinity, a 3 in 1, 1 in 3. But my experience, growing up as Christians, still go to church occasionally, don't understand what that means. They really don't understand experientially what the Holy Trinity is or means. So that's in the back of my motivation to write this book. So because I'm taking a completely different track. I treat the Holy Trinity not as a dogma or a doctrine, which most people do, but more as an experience. And I make the argument that Jesus Christ had a Trinitarian awareness, that his awareness revolved in this tripartite way as he was interacting with people, as he did his ministry. So that's in the background. I'll get to that in a second. I have to tell just a little personal story why I wrote this book.
Please.
So I grew up in the Lutheran tradition where this Jesus was on my grandmother's wall, and she was German Lutheran, and she taught me how to pray. And I grew up in it, as you know, Phil. My parents were in the bar business. So I was growing up in the bar business where my parents would come home alcoholic in an alcoholic haze at 2 a.m. when the bar closed. And I'd be in charge of my younger siblings to get us out the door, et cetera, et cetera. But I always had this experience at Graham and Gramps' house. They took us in, me and my siblings. And this Jesus was the same as, these are painted by the same painter, by Warner Salmon in the 1920s, 30s. And these images of Jesus became Jesus for millions of people. And for me, because I experienced chaos in my life. And I was in trouble with the law. I was arrested for breaking and entering when I was 11 because I hated people who had stuff, who were happy, and I wanted their stuff. And I thought the only way to get their stuff is to steal it. And they a cop caught me, put me in a jail cell, and I had to wait for my mother. And while I was waiting for my mother, he took me out and put me in the magistrate's office, and I went in there and he closed the door, and I went into the magistrate's desk and I stole a pair of sunglasses while I was waiting for my mother. I was hardcore, and I carried a switchblade knife which I brought to my first classes in Lutheran sort of bar mitzvah in the Lutheran tradition. And one of my classmates from high school in the 60s remembered me walking in a black leather jacket with a switchblade as I was beginning.
What we called in those days a juvenile delinquent.
Yes, that's right. Well, lots of things changed for me. I was fortunate to find some good people to help me through life. And but this Jesus was always there in my prayer life right from the beginning. Grandma taught me this prayer, which everyone in Germany knows, by the way. It's Ich bin klein, mein Herz ist rein, niemand im Wohnen aus Jesus allein. I am small, my heart is pure, no one lives in my heart but Jesus alone. And Jesus was the manifestation of love. You know, when he's opening he's knocking at the garden door of our hearts. Okay. And never mind what he looks like. I mean, he was, he was painted by Werner Selman, who was a businessman. And Werner Selman had this experience of a divine someone through Jesus, or Jesus was his introduction. So, but I ended up going to Luther College. I was going to be a minister. The Vietnam War started. I began to feel, and there was a Time magazine article, I think it was Time, or was it Newsweek, God is dead, or is God dead?
Time, a very famous article in Time.
Yeah, Time. Okay, thank you. So it was like mid-60s, I think.
Yeah.
And that's when I was at Luther College, and I thought, why am I being trained in theology when, it's irrelevant. There is no God. So I transferred to Dartmouth and majored in government because I was going to be a senator. Like, that's the way to change things. But unfortunately or fortunately, one of the first things that happened at Dartmouth, and it was hard work for me because I didn't have any money and I had several part-time jobs. I walked in by mistake to a Taekwondo karate class at Alumni Hall at Dartmouth, which is, this huge old building from the 19th century. And there on the top floor, a wooden structure, there were like 30 Dartmouth guys. It was all men at that time. And the teacher was Donnie Miller, who had been trained by a Chan teacher. So I was learning meditation. And he would do things like and we broke bricks and we broke stuff, with our edge of our hands and stuff. And then he told us to go outside into the Hanover winter and snow barefoot, walk in the snow barefoot. And the instruction was warm your feet with chi. Mm. So I had been, Christian, and this is sort of spiritual to me. I didn't go to church then. I dropped church, but I still was thinking about Jesus. And I wondered, did Jesus have chi? And that was like one of the first convergences for me of East-West spirituality. Maybe
explain briefly for people who don't know what chi is.
Yeah, it's the living body energy and spirit and soul energy and mind energy. It's a sacred. Well, Thich Nhat Hanh once said that the Holy Spirit was chi, or was like chi. So it's like that. So that got me wondering, and then I discovered Thomas Merton, and here is an image of Thomas Merton sitting and meditating. Trappist monk. He had friendships with the Dalai Lama and with other teachers. And notice how where his hands are.
The mudra.
Yeah, full lotus position. And his hand is in the mudra, and the other hand is touching the earth. And there are stories of the Buddha touching the earth when he was enlightened. And there's also a story of Jesus touching the earth when he forgave a woman who was caught in adultery, and she was going to be stoned to death. And he, I don't want this to fall over. And he dropped to the ground, all these screaming people and the guys with their rocks, and they said, what should we do with her? And it was a test, because if he was a true Jewish teacher, if he was a rabbi like he said he was, he would stone her because that was the law. But his other followers are thinking, well, if he's really a spiritual teacher who is transcending the law to this divine presence, he'll let her go. And he knew it was a test, like, and they might kill him. So he dropped to the ground. He touched his fingers into the earth, and then he slowly got up and he said, "Let the one without sin cast the first stone." And I just think that's such a powerful story. And it's an earth story and an inspiration story. So after Dartmouth, I was a Vista volunteer. I became a farmer. I was an organic farmer in New Hampshire for 5 or 8 years. Then I couldn't support a family, so I decided I'm going to go back to school. So I went to Harvard. I majored in peace studies, but I got into an argument with my dissertation director, and I changed my whole program from peace studies to psychotherapy. And I also did that because I went into psychotherapy for the first time in 1980 and realized, fuck, but this is what's going to bring peace, man. Everybody has to get some psychotherapy, you know? So yeah, it changed my life. And that's where I met Henri Nouwen, and then he was teaching at Harvard, and we became close friends. He helped me start the Empty Bell in the Boston area in 1994 as the go-to place in Boston for Buddhist-Christian dialogue. So I would invite. It was in a separate building, a carriage house. I'd invite Christian monks and nuns and Buddhist monks and nuns together. Like there might be 20 of us. They all brought their robes of their various traditions, and that was my work for 11 years in Boston.
You know, I can't tell you how many people we've had on the show who bring up Merton as an inspiration, mostly Christians, but not entirely.
Yeah.
What was Merton's take on the Trinity, and how did that influence your thinking in writing the current book?
It's a really good question. I reviewed, researched for myself, for my own heart, and also for the book, about 18 Christian mystics over the centuries, beginning in the 3rd, 4th centuries. And Merton is on that list. But I didn't emphasize his work on the Trinity because I had other interests, that's all. And I should mention that I had a whole chapter on those mystics in this book, but Robert Ellsberg at Orbis Books, who is a good friend of mine, he basically told me, it's too big, this book is too big. So I dropped the whole mystics chapter. And so now the whole book is more like a memoir of my spiritual passage and so on. So if you want to read Merton, though, anyone who does, I created a website to announce the new book. It's called mydearfar-nearness.org. And there is that dash between far and near, mydearfar-nearness.org. And you'll see a mystics link, and it will list all these mystics and my take on them. So that's, yeah.
So tell us what you mean and how you interpret this standard Christian teaching of the Holy Trinity, how you came to understand it, and how you're unpacking it in this book.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So there's over 200 pages here, so I'm going to try to do a summary that makes some sense to folks. So the Trinity is in Genesis. Jesus, I have to say first, Jesus was a Jew, right? No question. He was a devoted Jew. So everything he taught arose through his training in the Jewish tradition. So in Genesis, God creates creation. Elohim in Hebrew creates all of creation from nothing. So before time and space existed, there was nothing, right? And then there was something. And then one of the first lines in Genesis is saying that we humans are created in the image and likeness of God. So who is God is the question. And what does God's identity have to do with our identity? That question led me into right into this book. So if we say that we're made in the image and likeness of God, then who am I is an important question. What does that mean? I'm God. Well, who is God? And then that led me from the Jewish tradition where God is one to the Christian tradition, the early creeds. We're talking 4th and 5th century, the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedon Creed, and finally settled on in the 8th century, not until the 8th century, that God is three in this sense. Jesus says, who is Jesus? Okay, so Jesus comes and he says, when you see me, you see the Father. And the Father is the creator, Elohim. But he used pater, or he used Abba in Aramaic. But what he meant was the creator who creates everything from nothing before there's time and space. So Jesus said, when you see me, you see the Father. You see the creator. Like, that blew my mind to really get that, what that means. And then he gives the gift of the Holy Spirit. Everybody's sad because he's going to be executed. All his friends are just like, wailing and trying to save him. Like, we'll get an army together. And he says, because he was threatening to the religious authorities, that he says, don't worry. I will always be with you, and I will send you the Spirit. And so what the creeds then did is to say that Creator is God, Jesus is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. And it took them a while to get there. It took like about 4 centuries for them to get there, which means that when we're in the presence of the Spirit, we're in the presence of God. When we're in the presence of Jesus, we're in the presence of God. When we're in the presence of the Creator, we're in the presence of God. So that's one part of it. But then I was reading Aristotle and Aquinas later, who both had this theory of perception that I can only perceive you, Phil, accurately when I get in touch with the Phil inside me.
Mm.
What I see is what I am. Who I see is who I am. And Jesus said to his friends before he died, I'm in you and you're in me, in John 14. Okay, so there's this sense of this interrelational identity, which in the book I compare and contrast, and it's pretty much the same as Thich Nhat Hanh's interbeing, that we inter-are with each other, which echoes this whole Trinitarian sense that we are a dance around of love. The Greek, the word they came up with about this dance around of awareness of love is perichoresis. Peri is around and choresis is dance. So we are this dance around of love. And Jesus is saying, everything I have, I give to you.
Mm.
So if you think about this, Jesus said, when you see me, you see the Father. And then he says to us, everything I am, you are. I'm in you, you're in me. Well, wait a minute. That, and most Christians, I don't think really get what that means. That means that we can manifest the Creator, the ultimate reality, ourselves. That, in a sense, that everything and everyone is God, which is very Advaita Hindu, I think.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. So that's where I go with the Trinity, is that we can't perceive the Trinity unless we are the Trinity, and that, based in Aristotle and Aquinas's word for that is connaturality, that the world is in us, we are in the world. But this is, I have to say, this is difficult track to take with the Trinity because it's very demanding. Nobody can do this Trinity thing, which I liken to St. Paul's The Mind of Christ, because I think Jesus's mind was Trinitarian. You can't do this unless you have a spiritual practice, unless you spend some time in silence, unless you then apply what you're learning in silence in your relationships and in your work. And that's where it becomes political too. I do a lot of environmental work and, very practical work, financial, legal stuff to save land and habitat. And this is what motivates me to keep going when I get hopeless about it and I can't raise enough money to save more habitat or whatever. It just keeps me going. So I don't fall into despair about climate change and all that crap that's going on.
Jonas, you to unpack the Trinity even further, I'll read from the material from your website. You say that the Holy Trinity is not merely an abstract doctrine, it's a living experience that we can learn to practice in solitude, relationships, and communities. Yeah. And then you go into each person, so to speak, yeah, in the Trinity. So that's also a question. What does the person in the first, second, third persons that people associate with the Trinity, and that makes people very confused? It's like, how can one person be three persons?
I know.
I mean, that's a simplistic thing, but that's what people think.
Well,
so explain.
Walt Whitman said, I contain multitudes. So
that's right.
We're many people. We're complex creatures. The thing is, but personhood is so interesting, because what are persons? In our culture, we're consumers, right? And people are trying to sell us stuff, and we're treated as its consumer products and so on and so forth. So the word person means there's a subjectivity in us that is divine to me. And so the persons of the Trinity are like three dimensions of my awareness. Each one is holy. In the first person, can I read just a little bit? Okay. So the first person is the creator, who can't be conceptualized or known as an object of awareness. The only way to experience the first person is to let go of all images, opinions, judgments, even our cherished theologies about God. Saint Teresa of Avila believed we can only do this when we descend into the nameless, sacred selfhood, capital S, at the center of the soul, which she called the interior castle. I understand this castle to be a sacred dwelling place in our souls and in our awareness that is free of social conditioning, free of ego self-narratives. On our way into this castle, we find guidance, inspiration, comfort by believing. There's a belief quality, believing in the qualities of God in the Hebrew Christian scriptures, love, tenderness, mercy, forgiveness, and so on. But to finally enter, we must be naked, without any belief. Our protective clothing of language and ideas is eventually burned away in the furnace of transformation. So that's like the first person, which is very Buddhistic in a sense, and Meister Eckhart was really loved by many Zen masters. Eckhart said, what did he say? He said many things. The eyes with which I see God are the eyes with which God sees me. Now, he's a very non-dual person. And
yes, indeed.
I would put him in the first person category of awareness, where there's no concept, nothing. But the second person is this manifestation of Jesus, where he's all about relationships. He's always going out and forming relationships with friends, with family. He struggles with family and so on and so forth. But it's all about Martin Buber's, the Jewish philosopher.
I thou.
I thou. It's all I thou, which is a little different than the nothingness, the emptiness of the first person. Right. So the second person is friendship, like my friendship with you, Phil. For me, as a Christian, my friendship, there's a divine quality to I thou with you, which means, which holds me to certain standards like honesty and friendship and love and curiosity and getting to know one another. So that's the second person, is the I thou. And then the third is the spirit, which in the Christian tradition brings me out into the world with other people to feel this movement toward embodied love. Like Martin Luther King used the phrase beloved community, and he often said it was the Holy Spirit that led him into that. Cesar Chavez, migrant workers, also lots of talk about the Holy Spirit, and I include their quotes in my book. So that's the first person is the dimension of mystery and presence, The second person, where there's no categorization, and no opinions, only presence. The second person is the I thou, and the third is, going out and creating community. That's beloved community. That's the three.
And there's an interesting macro micro kind of feeling to your take on the Trinity, in the sense that there's something vast and abstract and universal about the sort of theory or philosophy of how you see the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also this, it's within you. We all are the Trinity.
Yes.
And we all have those persons within us, or those means of perception within us. And that brings it into the realm of practical reality, as opposed to theology and doctrine. And so your book also promises that there are practices in each of these categories of first, second, third person, or Father, Son, Holy Ghost kind of thing, that I assume the practices are meant to heighten one's capacity to experience these aspects of the divine. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you. That's a really good point, because that's the second half of the book, are the practices. How do we enter into the mystery of ourselves and the mystery that is beyond us, far-nearness? And how do we enter into the I-thou relationships, like yours and mine, again, and also how do we enter into this movement of spirit, which is, in a sense, seeking something, that is seeking the harmony of human relationships across cultures and races and so on. And I want to give you one example, and then I end the book with an epilogue on Schindler's List. And the reason I do it, there's a whole chapter on Schindler's List. I call it a window into Trinitarian consciousness. And I closely examine Oskar Schindler's final moments in the concentration camp, when he has been a really despicable man, coming into the work with the Nazis and making money as fast as he can, and using Jewish folks as workers who are not paid very much and they're taken advantage of. He gradually learns to love them while he's running these factories. And he takes it so personally that at the end of the movie, you probably remember, the Nazis have been defeated elsewhere, but they still have their guns at the factory. And Oskar Schindler is standing on our ramparts looking down at all the mostly Jewish workers, but he himself is Catholic. And he got out in touch with his Catholic tradition for a long time, but his wife is Catholic, and he gets back together with her, and after a lot of adulterous affairs, and there at the end, he's like a redeemed person. He looks out at all the Jewish folks, and the Nazis are standing there on another rampart with their guns, and he looks up at them and he says, "I know that you've been told to kill all of us, everyone in this room and me, and now's your chance." So he just becomes naked in front of the Nazi guards and in front of all the people, and it's because of his love for the workers now. And a rabbi in the group, while the Nazis are thinking about what they're going to do, this rabbi in the group starts singing the Kaddish, and he's singing the Kaddish, and pretty soon all these hundreds of workers start singing it, and Oskar Schindler starts singing it. And while he's singing it, he touches the cross on his lapel, the cross of Jesus. And it's like the boundaries of love have collapsed. it's just so beautiful. It brings tears to my eyes. And then a little bit later, when the Nazis are starting to leave the plant, he's out on the railroad tracks with some of the workers, and they have their striped uniforms and so on and so forth. And he hugs the guy who plays his accountant,
Ben Kingsley.
Ben Kingsley. They hug, and it's so sweet, and they're crying, and Ben Kingsley is thanking him, and Oskar Schindler says, "I could have saved more. I could have saved more." Oh my God! And then they're going to be driven out. He and his wife are going to be driven out, but he doesn't want to be mistaken for a Nazi, or they don't want him to be mistaken for a Nazi. So they give him the striped uniforms of prisoners. And so Oscar and his wife are driven out of the camp dressed as prisoners. I mean, the whole thing that Spielberg put together is just so beautiful. And to me, it's an incarnation of the Trinity. A love that dissolves all the boundaries between us, and also recognizes our distinctiveness. The Kaddish is not Christian, the cross is not Jewish, but they're together. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does to me. Much to think about in that, Jonas. We don't have much time, but I'll give you the last word. What would you like our listeners and anybody who reads your book, what is the primary takeaway you'd like us to have?
I suppose to go right to the heart of it, to be inspired for this longing that you mentioned at the beginning here, the longing. Believe in the longing of your heart to love and to be loved. Believe in that, because that's, if anything's going to save us in this planet that's falling apart with political polarization, with climate change, it's what's ahead is going to be so bad. I think the only thing that's going to save us is that love. And I hope my book helps.
Thank you for that. Hold up the cover again.
Yeah.
So let's be commercial here. Sell some books. My Dear Far-Nearness, The Holy Trinity as Spiritual Practice, Robert A. Jonas, Orbis Books. Those of you listening and can't see the cover, Google it. And I was very happy to have you on, because I love fresh interpretations of what can be very stale spiritual and theological concepts. And I think the Holy Trinity is one that's cried out for a fresh look. And so I hope people pay attention to it. And I love that you interiorize it instead of just making it, some abstract concept or an article of faith.
Yeah, thank you.
So thanks for being with us. And listeners, again, if you're tuning in for the first time, go to the website, spiritmatterstalk.com, and our YouTube channel. Hit the subscribe button. It's all free. And if you would like to contribute to our upkeep so we can keep it free, please do. It's as Dennis always says, we're not a nonprofit, so it's a contribution, not a tax deduction. So factor that into your math.
Right.
And we'll see you next.
Let me also mention emptybell.org.
Emptybell.org. With that on emptybell.org
and mydearfarnearness.org.
My Dear Far-Nearness with the hyphen.org. All that'll be on the website when this is posted.
Okay, I just
Jonas.
Wait.
One more thing. Show and tell. What is this?
I'm playing shakuhachi here, so right? But I'm not going to play it because we don't have time. But this is the first person of the Trinity playing shakuhachi. That is, the person has no identity. And
when I saw you a few months ago, you gave me this CD, so we might as well hold this up. I happen to have it right next to me. Yeah. Blowing Bamboo.
That's available on iTunes, by the way.
Oh man, if I were a nasty guy, I'd say, "Who's Bamboo?" I won't do it.
No. Thank you.
Take care,
Okay.
Jonas.
Phil, you're a good man. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.